thank you so much for sharing this with us. I will now like to invite everyone to have a look at the questions that have been put forward. I'd like to invite Professor Sandra to also join us in the panel, and we'll proceed to go through the questions. We've had questions coming up from, I think they started at the very beginning of Professor Sandra's presentation earlier, and I can see many coming up now. The way that this works is that I will ask the questions in order of your preference. So please feel free to look at your Q&A window, vote, and that will influence the ones that we are able to cover in the next, we got about 42 minutes or so. So thank you both again for those two fantastic presentations about such topical issues, you know, the things that really are so important in our work. And let's move on without further ado to the first question that I got at the top. And that is from Liam in Kovsava. And it reads, the additional trauma torture that our government is implementing and authorizing is a national shame. In reflecting upon the impacts that extended detention has on human beings in your study, Professor Sandra, are there any legal mechanisms to pursue national governments regarding the damage that they are contributing to for the asylum seeker refugee population? Thank you for your presentation. Sure.
Thank you, Jorge. That's a very important question. There are quite a number of legal actions that have been undertaken and are currently being undertaken. People may be familiar that there was, in fact, a victory in the PNG courts about the detention, and there has been a compensation that's been paid to people who were detained in Papua New Guinea. But there continue to be ongoing legal actions claiming damages for the sorts of things that I've described in my presentation.
Thank you. Next question comes from Dr. Shakemu Martin, and it's also addressed to Professor Sandra. Reads, you mentioned resignation syndrome. I find it very interesting, although when it was first coined, it was surrounded with a lot of controversy. Have you in your research or clinical journey been confronted or met refugee children with this condition?
Yeah, so I did allude to this in my presentation. And I know that I'm stepping on into controversial territory here. I think the children that, so firstly, I didn't see the children in Sweden, so I can't comment about their clinical profile. I'm only aware of what's been described in the literature of the Swedish cohort where resignation syndrome was first described. I have, however, seen quite a considerable number of children who were on Nauru and then were subsequently transferred to Australia. And I would, in comparing the two conditions, say that what we saw in Nauru and in Australia was different to what was described in the Swedish literature. There was pervasive food and fluid refusal, there was withdrawal from communication, and there was, in many of the children, associated self-harming behaviours, though not all children. And so superficially, I think there is a resemblance with the resignation syndrome. However, as people would be familiar, the treatment that was implemented in Sweden was to remove parents from the family dynamic because it was believed that the parents potentially were perpetuating the disorder and the distress seen in the children there. If that had been done here, that would have been catastrophic for the children and catastrophic for the parents. I think it would have potentially resulted in deaths, I suspect. So I'm advocated very strongly that that shouldn't happen. And it would be fair to say that all the children that I'm aware of anyway, and I'm not aware of the entire cohort, have actually now all of them recovered relatively quickly within a few weeks of return or being transferred to Australia. So I would say it was different, but I think it is an ongoing discussion.
Thank you. And Susan, please feel free to comment on any of the questions that I know that you also have, quite a lot of experience in this field. So
okay, I will.
Please don't feel constrained to. Yep. Look, then there's a follow-up question, which is, are you seeing, that comes from Jenny Jason, and it reads, are you seeing similar implications in adults and children seeking asylum who have not been in offshore detention?
Yeah, so I did make this comment, and again, it was a very brief comment at the beginning of my presentation. The reason I presented you these data rather than data from what we might term the larger proportion of asylum seekers that are in Australia is because I don't think there's anything that is grossly different. What I think has happened is that in the detained cohort, what we see is a concentration and an acceleration of the same psychopathological features as we see in the cohort of asylum seekers that live within the community. That the detention experience is awfully traumatic for people. I can't overemphasize how traumatic it is, but I'm also aware that we're dealing with a group of people who are extraordinarily resilient, and that the very act of being able to come to Australia demonstrates a high level of competency and resilience to be able to manage that. They deal with the immigration detention experience as long as it's not, as long as it's not 10 years, which it is for many. But then when they transition into the community, the same factors which operate on the cohort who have always lived in the community, not been detained, still apply to this group. So all that I think we see is an acceleration and a concentration in the detained cohort, but just about everything that I've said would apply to a lesser degree in the sense of potentially less severe in the cohorts that have lived in the Australian community all along and had limited or minimal experience of detention.
Thank you.
So I will just add something there.
Please.
Which is just that in working with asylum seekers and people who are on bridging visas, the fear of being returned to the country of origin and the fear of going back, being sent back, is huge. It really is a major source of worry and stress for people, and it continues to undermine their safety as well, particularly for women in domestic violence relationships, for example, that may not want to speak out, and also seeking help as well in hospitals and so on, drawing attention to them and their situation worries them because they couldn't be returned. I just want to add.
Thank you. And the next question from Philip Feinstein really addresses both of these topics and the combination, I suppose. So I certainly invite you both to address it. It reads, the stress and mental anxiety that detainees in Villawood and other detention centers are currently experiencing because of COVID is huge. The number of refugees being vaccinated is being kept secret, as is information about those who have contracted the virus. Do you know any of those figures? Volunteers and visitors to Villawood are currently restricted, so our live music programs have been restricted for the past year. Music is a huge stress reliever that is missing for all refugees. Now that Sydney's open, why can't Villawood do the same? So any figures and certainly your opinions about this issue?
I don't have any figures. I don't think they're easily able to be obtained, although it hasn't been a focus of mine in particular, but I'm aware of this situation. I think there needs to be a lot more transparency, obviously, and we need to know, and I totally agree that if Sydney is open with the prevalence of COVID-19, why on earth wouldn't we be trying to assist people in Villawood with the same kinds of freedoms, and particularly freedom to come to mainland Australia to get on with their lives, and not have that all the other health problems that they face in Villawood on top of COVID-19.
Thank you. Professor Sandran?
Yes, I similarly don't have any data. I think, as the questioner stated, I think there is a veil of secrecy over this. I know that many of us right at the outset of the pandemic represented very strongly that there was no reason for most people who are in immigration detention to remain in immigration detention, and it would be much safer for them to be placed in community detention. That advice wasn't heeded. We've now seen in Melbourne one of the locked detention facilities being overrun with COVID infection, as was entirely predictable. And yes, I won't make any comment. I think that just speaks for itself.
Thank you. Next question comes from Claire, and basically she acknowledges that these facts are truly heartbreaking. And the question reads, you have mentioned that these awful conditions have led to feelings of hopelessness and feeling broken that are difficult to treat. Do you have any ideas or suggestions from your experience that assist people and communities to rebuild after such an ordeal?
Two points. I mean, this is one of those situations where, in fact, the social treatment of the disease or the disorder is paramount. It is about providing a safe, secure pathway for people to resettle and to resume their lives. The point that I was making around the persistent nature of these disorders is that in cohorts that we've previously worked with who've had extended periods of detention from the 2001 to 2007 experience, or from the 1992 subsequent detention experiences, many of these people don't actually recover. So even though they are ultimately socially treated by being allowed to resettle in Australia, they don't get better. And I think this is going to be the same sequelae for a proportion of the people that I've described in the last, since 2012. One comment, and this is what I tell my registrars and the clinicians that I work with, is that the work that we do is fundamentally important because we represent two elements. The first element is that we can be a trusted, secure figure, that we can represent some goodness within the community, and that we can act in a way which people can re-establish a sense of trust. That's the first thing. And the second thing that we can do is that although we can't ever provide false hope, we can remain an aspirational hope for people. And if we're able to do those two things, and that may for many people be the only things that we can do, that is probably also all we can do. And in that setting, we can keep people going for a period of time. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'm seeing that now 8 years down the track, 9 years down the track, that's getting to the point of wearing out. And I'm fearful of the consequences.
Yes, certainly what we've seen in the field. Professor Rees, anything you'd like to add? I know you've had a lot to do with communities, and certainly.
No, I mean, I think Suresh dealt very well with that answer. I mean, I mean, my only thing that I find is useful, and I was thinking about, Professor Derek Siloff's ADAPT model, is making sure that you're taking into account structural factors as well. And that when you raise these with people, no matter how, what their level of literacy or understanding of, political factors are, when people start to understand disadvantage as something that happens to them, not as a result of their own failing, but as a result of structural factors beyond their control, it can actually be quite empowering. And I also think, therefore, bringing people together is really good, and getting people, into group therapies and so that they can share experiences and also support each other through that learning process of taking away the sense of guilt and sense of self-blame, and understanding the harms to them come as a result of other factors and it's empowering. It can be it can have a positive impact on the mental well-being.
Thank you. We'll move on now to a question from Vina O'Sullivan, and it reads: the women I have worked with haven't complained so much about social isolation. Fear has been amplified through the social networks about vaccine, long-term effects of COVID, and so forth. In their homes, they have been overwhelmed by caring for the families, getting no break from the children. Their workload has increased enormously. Food preparation, household chores, demands from the families, tensions within the family because of the lockdown and lack of physical and mental space, and so forth, have put a lot of pressure on the women. They have also stated that the disparity in language skills makes it hard for them. For example, their English and online skills are poor, but the children can speak well, etc. So they can't help them with their homework. All of this also enhances the trauma-related symptoms. My clients have also reported the issues you have raised in terms of healthcare, telehealth, and so forth. What is the best way to help them?
That point is one I wish I'd made, because this is a point that is actually, I agree, and it's really great to hear that you're finding it in your practice, because it has also come to our attention as the issue for women in the home, in the pressure cooker situation with children at home. But not only that, the disadvantage in not having the language or often the resources to be able to help their children with their homework. And that has been an enormous sense of stress. And, feeling that sense of, not being able to, showing your own failing to your children as well, that you're not actually able to understand what they're doing and so on, to be able to help them. So this has definitely come to our attention. I'm really pleased that you raised it, because it's an important one for people to be aware of. What was the other bit of that question about what can we do? What can we do about this? There was something just before that, though.
There was a lot about disparity and the fear factor.
Yes.
About a whole lot of issues, but not just about COVID itself, but
all the
vaccination and so on.
Exactly. Look, and that's why I talked about targeted support to groups. Now we've got evidence that there are specific and unique issues affecting these populations, and there needs to be public health programs directly supporting these populations and US workers with them, because I know that you would be under an enormous amount of pressure in your work dealing with the clients numbers that you would have, because the resources are very short. And as we're becoming more skilled, more aware, we need to have some general programs available to workers to provide some kind of continuity in terms of how we're approaching these problems with refugees. But it needs to be urgent, because it's happening now. And it is something that requires government to pay immediate attention to. And that's why I was sort of stressing the importance of getting our research out there, and also these important practice insights.
If I could add something to this question, because I don't think it's actually there, but it's certainly something that is come up in many discussions. What do you think may be, the impact going forward, even after we opened up? We've gone through a period of some, 18 months, and Melbourne in particular, and sure she can attest to that, would have been it's got that full title of being the most lockdown city in the world. What do you think are some of the effects that might endure for some time of this period?
Well, in the immediate term, I think we're going to see we know we're going to see numbers increase with COVID-19 in terms of health, impacts. And we already know disadvantaged groups, as I said, are going to suffer probably disproportionately in terms of the impact of that. The impacts on that, therefore, on mental health are significant. And when you have pre-existing mental health issues, these are compounding. I think we're going to see serious impacts. I'm really concerned about the numbers going up without the right infrastructure in place to help people who are particularly marginalised. As I said, people who are privileged have got recourse to other avenues, but these people do not. And I think all the things that Suresh was talking about, the things that people bring with them, the experiences are so significant, and they can be so triggered during this time. And I think the loss as well is going to be huge as people start to get sick family members. How do you cope? You don't know whether trust health authorities. You're concerned about death. Is a major issue because of your closer proximity to it in an existential sense. So yeah, lots to be concerned about. And moving forward, what will this do to settlement? Progress during settlement. When we see populations, maybe we'll see where we had seen certain trends in settlement. Maybe we'll see those significantly affected by COVID and the impact of COVID. I think, of course, we will, because like everyone, actually, in their own way, we're being affected by it. But these are very serious issues, and populations that contribute so important to our society that we need to make sure that they're not being disadvantaged and that progress is not in any way curtailed.
Thank you. Suresh, I could see you nodding furiously a couple of times. Anything you'd like to contribute to?
No, so I completely agree with the comments that Susan's made. I would add that this cohort have been more adversely affected by the economic downturn. Many of these people are in unstable, insecure work. Many of them are being exploited by their employers. They're the first ones to lose work, and they're the last ones to be re-employed. So the financial stress is a practical and significant additional adversity. It obviously affects the whole population, but this cohort again are peculiarly and severely affected.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next question that comes from Nasreen Nasrat, and it reads, it would be helpful to mention unaccompanied minors who grew into adults in Australian offshore detention centres, or RPCs, such as Nauru Island, and their parents would think of them as a child when they leave their home country. So anything you can add about, particularly the impact on minors of these experiences?
Thank you for highlighting that group as well. They have had the same experiences as many of the adolescents who are part of family units, but they've had the added experience of not only being unable to engage in any sort of post-secondary school vocational training or activity, with the fact that they're also isolated and separated from their parents and from other family members. And so they represent a uniquely vulnerable subgroup within the population. We've seen that many of them have formed some friendship links with each other and with other family groups that were on the islands, but they're fairly tenuous links. And I think that this group, again, will be one that we'll need to keep a very close eye on to see how they manage, because I think they're doing poorly.
Thank you, Professor Sandra. Can I go to you, Susan, and extend this question to the impact, of you know, the COVID-19 and again that ongoing impact, particularly on minors, and you would have, I'm sure, heard, you know, from some of the worries, you know, coming in from the mothers in your research. Anything you'd like to add to that?
On the mental health of children?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. During COVID-19, we actually, I mean, we've got a really important data set that we need to look at, because we are measuring using the ASQSE, we're measuring development and behaviour in children. So we've got an amazing capacity to look at this empirically. But if I were to address this just anecdotally, I would say that the issue that someone raised before, the practitioner, about children at home in the household locked in and whatever, and trying to cope with their homework, I think the day-to-day functioning for children has been seriously impacted by having to be at home. And of course, when people have additional trauma affected by trauma, and you're locked in the house with adults affected by trauma, that is bound to have an impact on how children are feeling and coping with the day-to-day things that all our kids have had to deal with being locked at home. But in addition, you know, having a mum not able to help or dad not able to help with homework because they don't understand, plus your own trauma and trying to manage that, and conflict in the home. Witnessing violence in the home, we've heard, and we've got some evidence about increased rates of intimate partner violence, because of course dad is probably at home more often as well, so that increases the risk of intimate partner violence right there, because he's just simply around more. If there's already intimate partner violence, because I'm not saying it's related to COVID, that it may be exacerbated by COVID-19. And so children exposed to more violence in the home, more tension, more stress. It'll be interesting to see, but again, unfortunately, I think we will see impacts, negative impacts on development, and even potentially imagining school readiness and school performance and school readiness. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. It's certainly a population that we are very concerned about, and we can see that the impact, and as you're saying, the most vulnerable populations are impacted the most. Yeah. And I think that, you know, children and young people in general, I think, you know, are one of the groups that are often, where it is often harder to detect, you know, this interaction between trauma and other stresses that are happening. So yeah. Thank you so much. The next question addresses a different topic, and one that the two of you as researchers might want to comment on. It comes from Dr. Gabby and Sarah, and it reads: it doesn't help that research in this field erases, excludes, or mischaracterizes people with marginalized genders, sexualities, bodies, and relationships. It is a very heteronormative field, and also assumes all societies have only two genders, ignoring traditional genders beyond the Anglo two, and how people fleeing that kind of gender-based violence experience further gender-based violence as people with trans and gender diversity lived experience. So what are you and your colleagues doing to address this erasure and discrimination in the field of, in the area of research?
It's not an either or. It's a really important area. It's really important to maintain a gendered focus on intimate partner violence, because it affects women disproportionately, or women who, any women disproportionately, but also trans women and lesbians. So it's really important to maintain a power as well as a gender analysis in this field. A lot more research is needed. We do see rates of intimate partner violence similar or even slightly higher than affecting cisgender women, and we know there are unique issues. And I support people to conduct research specifically in this field. As I said, it's not an either or, that's for sure. It's not a competition, but it's really important to do it. And I have actually published a paper supporting someone from the LGBTIQ community who we wrote about a paper that's supporting or that's increasing awareness for general practitioners and who are coming in contact with LGBTIQ people who may be at risk of or suffering gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, and what the unique issues are. And that was a great experience for me, and I thought it was a really important contribution to the field. There are emerging researchers in the field, and I think it's something we really need to get behind, and thank you for raising it. It's important.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge. The point is very well made by the questioner, and I support Susan's comments. I can only add that this cohort in both the offshore centres, both in Nauru and in Manus Island, which were the host communities, were very traditional, where homosexuality in particular was frowned upon, had extraordinarily difficult time and an extraordinarily difficult experience in those communities and in those settings, and had to essentially hide their sexuality and their gender diversity in ways which made it doubly traumatic for them. It would be great, I think, if somebody wanted to pick that up as a research theme to add to this literature. That would be a very important contribution. Thank you both.
We'll move on to the next question. The answers will come from you. And the next one is addressed to Professor Sandra. And it reads, given the highly damaging long-term mental effects of offshore detention on asylum seekers and refugees, it is of major concern that the UK, Denmark, and Hungary are considering the dreadful detention policy Australia has utilized as a model, I would say. Has your research been shared with the UN Commissioner of Human Rights and the UN General Secretary to warn other countries not to implement such damaging detention policies?
Yes, great question. We've been trying to convince the UK, certainly the Labour opposition, I think, have been won over and will oppose the bill in its current formulation. But as we saw in Australia, what happened from a political perspective, I think that it's very likely that will be played out in a very similar political way in the UK. Been presenting to the United Nations on a number of occasions. I think the United Nations, and it was very interesting, I was recently speaking at a Vatican-sponsored meeting, and the sad tragedy of it is that around the globe, very few people can even conceive that we have done what we have done with the attendant consequences. They're all aghast at the descriptions that I had in my talk, which I presented, and they find it hard to believe that such a wealthy and prosperous country can be doing these things. So I think there is a lack of global appreciation for what it is that has happened here and about the attendant consequences. Yeah, so clearly the point is that we need to keep trying to demonstrate and tell people who want to listen what the impacts are.
Thank you, Professor Sandra, and certainly the research that you've been conducting continues to add some I suppose much needed evidential data to support those arguments. I think it's so important to ensure that these the Australian policies are not seen as a model internationally, which sadly some regimes are looking at, and I know that many have not implemented them just because of the resources involved and the numbers involved in many of the countries that were addressed in the question. So thank you so much. That question, by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, came from Lila Bertel. We'll move on to the next one, which comes from Manuel Morantes and reads, do you have information about how the local population, I think that's addressed to you, but maybe you both can answer. Do you have information about how the local population in Nauru interacts with the one in the detention center? One of my clients mentioned that local males have the expectation of having sex with women in the detention centers.
Yeah, very happy just to start the conversation here. So the host community had very little knowledge of what it was that was going to happen. Many people saw that the people that were going to be brought were going to take over the island and were somehow going to destroy the community. So there was a lot of antipathy, whereas others felt it as an opportunity to demonstrate hospitality and generosity towards the refugees. The people who were employed as guards had multiple expectations. So yes, at one end we had people who saw the refugees and asylum seekers as exploitative or being able to be exploited in some way. And then people at the other end, saw it as a way to earn a lot of money very quickly. So there are lots of a spectrum of perspectives and attitudes. No question, there was an element of sexuality in that, and in particular violence in that. And this is interesting. The reports that have come to me, and I'm not saying that I have a complete understanding of this all, but a significant proportion, if not all of the reports that I heard of sexual violence were perpetrated by external people. There were some attempts by local people as well, but a lot of them didn't reach the formal recording stage of police reports. I'm sure there would have been, but I can't comment on that. The allegations of rape that I have directly heard were by external guards, people who have been flown into the island. But I'm sure that what the questioner has asked also happened.
Thank you. The next question follows on and on the same topic, and it's from Philip Feinstein again, and it reads, are refugees in detention able to be kept apart because of COVID, bearing in mind that they normally use a combined dining area?
So I'm not sure whether people are aware, but the regional processing centres are no longer detention, that they've been closed. So the one in Port Moresby, where people are housed, functions essentially as a hotel or a supported accommodation residence, and the people in Nauru live within the community setting in housing there. So people are able to come and go. The detention centres in Australia are two types. One is the standard immigration detention centre, where people who've overstayed visas or people on character grounds are being detained. And they've been functioning as detention centres. The alternate places of detention, such as the Park Hotel in Melbourne, which has attracted a lot of attention recently because COVID has penetrated that facility, have operated really as hotel quarantine, has operated in Sydney and Melbourne and other places. So people are confined to their rooms. They have limited or no shared spaces. They have limited or no access to outdoor spaces. So they're essentially locked in those facilities. And that for the most part has applied to people who have been in immigration detention offshore or onshore.
Thank you. Next question, also from Philip Feinstein, and this is one that I like, both of your perspectives, is on the subject of resignation syndrome. I have met refugees at Villawood who have expressed not wanting to be released, as they will not know how to handle normal life after so many years of being incarcerated. What are your comments on this? Who would like to go first? You both muted at the moment.
You go, Susan.
You're muted, Susan.
Oh, okay. Yes. I think so that transition back into normal life, whatever that is, outside detention. And of course, the longer you're institutionalized, the harder that becomes. We see that with people who are in prisons, and that the transition is really important, that supported transition. Is that the question I'm answering, the right one there? Yeah. And so I think it's a good point. It's a really important point because, of course, again, there are unique issues that are going to be impacting people who've fled trauma and then have been treated, the way they are in detention, and then have to be released into the community. So particularly important to focus on their transition and supporting them during that time, and of course material support. What we see with asylum seekers and refugees is financial issues being a major factor. So that's fundamental, is to make sure that people have the security and the capacity to survive, first of all, very well, and then to access all important settlement and trauma services available to them.
Thank you. Suresh, anything you'd like to add?
No, it is, as Susan's described, very similar to people re-entering the world from protracted imprisonment. But of course, these people have many times may not have had an extended experience of living in Australia prior to their detention. So they need far more support with regards to both English language, but also that whole process of acculturation and cultural familiarisation.
Thank you. We're getting to the end of the time we have for the seminar. There's one more question that I think we may be able to answer, and it's a generic question that I'd like you both to address, because it really comes to the topic of what do we do with all these things in the wider world. And it's from John Jegosothi, and it reads: has the consecutive governments made the policies knowing very well these effects could happen to these vulnerable, already traumatized people? And certainly both been in the field long enough to, I'm sure you have some opinions about, how is it that we arrived at one of the worst policies in the world in terms of how we deal with asylum seekers?
Look, it's very hard to answer this question without appearing to be political partisan in the issue. The development of policies has been one of a series of steps, so that it hasn't gone from 0 to 100 in one fell swoop. Every single policy decision that has taken us further along this road has been done and justified, and the Australian public has accepted those policy changes. There has been multiple elections since the introduction of the original Pacific solution in 2001, and we have, generally speaking, voted for the ongoing adoption of those policies and those policy directions, and certainly with the very significant reintroduction of the second opening of offshore regional processing, we've again accepted those decisions as a political majority. The general argument that has been presented to counter what I and many others have said has been that this is a greater good, that we need to maintain this policy position to prevent people smuggling, to prevent deaths at sea. I think this is ultimately a spurious argument, because most countries are able to manage to do both, and that is not to have people dying at sea, and to be able to provide a humane asylum and refugee perspective. You don't need to go very much past many countries in Europe. And, you know, I'll single out Angela Merkel as being a shining example in this space. So I think the argument is a spurious argument, but nevertheless, that's been used as the counterpoint.
Thank you so much. Susan, would you like to address this?
So I think Suresh covered that really well, and particularly focusing on the fact that governments tend to not be filled with vision or compassion, but merely think that they are reflecting or taking a policy stance which reflects the values of the population. So I think that's why translation is really important in our research and your practice insights, because if we can shape the broader community knowledge and understanding of issues affecting these important populations, then that will pressure governments because they'll respond to that. And that alone, unfortunately, because we know the nature of power and politics. But these are the things that we need to make more of to make people more aware of, so that they will not tolerate what we're getting insights into they may not know. And I have great faith in our community to demand better when they know what's going on, especially on these humanitarian issues. Of course, things are harder when social problems are greater. You know, people worry about jobs, they worry about disease, they worry about all these things. So these are things that we also have to be aware of and counter. And absolutely agree with that being a spurious response to, you know, the fear of people, you know, that we have these detention policies to ensure that people don't die at sea. I mean, that is utter rubbish. And there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that the people that were turned around, probably, you know, that we didn't see in detention, the people that were never followed up, we don't know what happened to them. And many people have died at sea that have not been recognised. In other words, we think the numbers have dropped, but have they? We don't know. And we don't know what's happening to them in the countries where they're waiting for somewhere to, you know, in camps and in countries where they're waiting for a place to live safe and secure. So we're not contributing in any way to assisting or supporting people with that policy, not in detention and not with the push factors that we need to be addressing more broadly at a global level. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much, and thank you for that very elegant answer, you know, from both of you to this difficult question that, you know, fills many of us with such anger that, you know, it's hard to formulate an answer to. So thank you so much. And thank you so much on behalf of our audience for your wonderful presentations, given, you know, your time and knowledge and expertise to, you know, continue to I suppose, add, you know, to what practitioners in the field can do for the very vulnerable populations that we work with. You've probably been too busy presenting and addressing the questions to have a look at the chat and some of the questions that remain unanswered, you know, and that denotes, I think, the interest from our audience. But you've had fantastic feedback from everybody that participated today. We had over 200 people participating, and that on behalf of the STARS, I'd like to thank you very, very much. I'd also like to thank our wonderful audience, you know, and the great questions that you both put forward. And of course, I'd like to thank our team at STARS, Nuria Merhabi, Emina Kovac, and Melanie Limon that put together this seminar and the 6 that you know that before. And I hope to see you all next year.